The Chariots of the Gods by Erich von Daniken. So I recently did a book haul, and I had found someone who had gone to an estate sale and bought hundreds of science fiction books from someone. And by the time I found this secondary person, they had about 70 books left, and I bought them all for $70. And I was going through some of the books, deciding which ones I wanted to keep or not. And I found this book in that lot. And I first did just a little research, and I decided I would keep it. And then I showed this off in my book haul. And I got a lot of comments about this book. And I was kind of caught up on a lot of my reading for the month. And so I decided I would at least start this book and see where it would take me. So I read it in 2 short sittings. It was a very quick, easy read. It was only 150 pages. You can kind of breeze right through this. There's no footnotes citing any kind of scientific evidence or papers or research or anything like that. You can just kind of read it for what it is. And it was written in 1968. And the more I was thinking about this book, I was thinking, how did I not know about this book? And it turns out, after digging in a little bit more, I realized I did hear about this author, and I knew about this book loosely. And what it was I used to listen to the Art Bell radio show, Coast to Coast AM, probably around the years of 1995 to 1998. I was living up in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I worked at a grocery store, stocking groceries at night. And most everybody would just listen to music on their headphones, but this one guy came up to me pretty early on when I started, and he said, "Hey, have you ever heard of Art Bell?" And so I started listening to this radio show almost every night that I worked, and I just loved it. You know, he would get all kinds of crazy guests on. He would have all kinds of crazy callers. They would talk about all kinds of different things. And I really thought of it as entertainment. And I wanted to believe a lot of these things, but you know, it's one of those things that a lot of the people writing these kind of books, or the people that Art would have on his show, kind of abandon the scientific method in their research. And while it's fun, it's interesting to think about and people have to kind of come up with these theories initially before they can be picked apart by the scientific community. I've always kind of enjoyed this type of nonfiction, or speculative nonfiction, or even pseudoscience, whatever you want to call it. I've read some books by Graham Hancock. Michio Kaku even kind of can get into this speculative nonfiction territory. And after I finished the book, I went back and listened to the Art Bell episode. And at the end of this little video review here, I'll talk about what he said and kind of how it aligned with some of what I was thinking as I was reading through this book. So this book was very influential. You can see here, I have this copy from 1980, and at the time it had sold 7 million copies. And now if you look it up, I think it says it sold somewhere around 70 million copies of this book. Van Daniken has written many other books on these kind of same topics and even more. And this is kind of what sparked the Ancient Aliens phenomenon. There was a TV show, and there was even a documentary of this book that came out, I believe, in 1970. So a lot came out. This was kind of the thing that launched a lot of ancient alien ideas. And a lot of people have made a lot of money off of this. It's sparked the imagination of a lot of people. And like I said, I want to believe this stuff, but I was really skeptical reading this, especially a book that came out in 1968, who I know most of these ideas and everything had been disproved. But I just went ahead, kind of read it with, trying to transform myself back in time. I wasn't even alive in 68, but I kind of tried to think of it that way as I read it, almost like I read science fiction. You kind of have to place yourself back in that time to understand it. And then you can look at it with a critical eye And there are some things I'll talk about at the end as well. Some tactics that people use in books like this that I can pick out pretty easy now. There's two tactics in particular he used. And I think, my younger self and back in the 60s and 70s, I think it was a lot easier to fall for some of these tactics. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. I'll give you just a brief summary of what his thesis is of this book. And there's kind of two things going on. The first idea is that we as a species, we have the almost destiny to leave the solar system and travel through the galaxy. And at some point, if we land on some planet that has a form of life that has a lower intelligence and technological ability than us, that we would appear to be gods to them. And they would create mythology and folklore, and we would probably leave behind artifacts. And he even talks sort of about some hard science about time dilation. And if we did send a group of astronauts out and then they made a return journey, that could sort of happen in these people's lifetime, depending on how far away they're going. But the gaps in a trip like this to the inhabitants on the planet would be vast amounts of time. And so if we sent a mission out to this planet and then these astronauts came back, by the time we got another trip to go out there, thousands of years would probably go by on the planet through their timeline. And so these gaps could lead to a lot of these things, like losing some of the knowledge of what we passed on to them, and some things like that. So part of this book is that it is our destiny to kind of become ancient aliens to some other form of life in the future. And that was pretty interesting. I didn't really know that side of this book. I knew the basic premise of everything else that he had kind of come up with in this book. But that part was kind of interesting, and it was a neat idea. Now, the main part that most people probably talk about and know about this book is he tries to kind of link some evidence that we have been visited by ancient aliens in the past. And he does this through a couple different ways. He looks at archaeological evidence in South America and Egypt, and folk stories and tales and mythology from even the Eskimos up in Alaska and all over the world, and how there is this kind of this unifying ideas and theories and imagery that was all over the world, even though humans weren't traveling all over the world. And so he kind of tries to say that the only way this could happen is if some aliens had come down onto the planet and were all over the planet and sharing some of this information, and then they left, So this archaeological evidence is spread out over the whole planet, and it really could only be explained through that. Another thing he tries to talk about is he links a lot of like biblical stories and some of the visions and some of the things that were going on throughout the Bible, and tries to explain those, that it probably wasn't God's, like the Bible tries to explain it as, but it could have been some alien race that was visiting the earth. He also talks about the Epic of Gilgamesh and other just, folklore, and how if you take the God part out of the equation, that it would have to be some sort of advanced alien civilization that had visited us. So, he talks about Easter Island. I took some notes here. He tries to kind of link all that up, and he really makes you think. There are some things that leave you scratching your head, but there's really, let's just kind of get into some of my skepticism of this. So a couple tactics he uses. One is just throwing out so much information in rapid fire succession, just shotgunning it all out there, and then trying to, like, it would take someone their whole lifetime to go piece by piece and try to disprove this using the scientific method. If you're just throwing a bunch of these things out there and leaving it up to the reader, or the author is kind of giving hints like, well, you know, all these mysteries could be solved, could be by ancient aliens, then he's kind of setting that idea in your head, and you think back and you go, well, yeah, that does kind of make sense. But it would just take you so long to disprove everything he throws in here. So it's almost this like shotgun style attack that is really hard for someone to critically come along and try to disprove. Now, over the years, I think a lot of the things he threw out in this book have kind of been disproved, but there is still a lot of mystery, and there's a lot of interesting things he brings up in this book. Now, the other thing that I noticed in this book was how many question marks were in the book. Even on the title, Chariots of the Gods, there's a question mark. I think in later editions of this book, he dropped the question mark. And when I was listening to this Art Bell episode, Erich von Daniken was saying, oh, you know, I wrote that book 30 years ago, because this interview took place in 1998. And he's like, I was young and dumb, and, you know, I have a lot of great ideas, but yeah, I didn't think a lot of things through, and there's definitely been some things that were disproven. And he even criticized himself. He said there was something like 238 question marks in this book. And that was one of the first things I noticed. He would throw out a couple interesting things and then ask some questions. And, you know, he doesn't want you to ask the questions. He's asking the questions because he's trying to guide the reader to these logical explanations that usually end up being that they were ancient aliens. And so even when you get to the last chapter in the book, I mean, there is a whole page that is nothing but questions, basically. It's just question after question, and the chapter is called Tomorrow. So, you know, it's a tactic he even knows. You know, it doesn't really hold its weight, but he made a lot of money off this book. He wrote a bunch of other books since then. I don't know if I want to go back and read any of the other things he's come up with. I like the idea of this. I really want to believe that we were visited by ancient aliens. But reading a book like this does not prove anything to me. It was fun. I'm glad I read it. I had some, you know, extra time this month to read, and I read it really quick. It's kind of like a little time capsule going back to 1968 and reading something like this. And I had fun with it, and I hope you guys had fun with this video review. This is the first nonfiction book I've reviewed on the channel. And, you know, maybe I will find some other books that kind of bridge between nonfiction and science fiction, because it's kind of a fun thing to kind of mix things up with. So that's going to be it for this video. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.